And we are live. Hello, everyone. I'm Jessper Maquindang. If you're here to build a stronger team and a more effective company culture, you're in the right place. In each episode, we have guests who provide tips, strategies, and insight to help you and your people thrive. And I'm very honored to introduce today's guest. Anthony Calleo is the founder and chief employee experience officer of Calleo EX, a consultancy that helps purpose driven organizations turn culture into business strategy, drawing on leadership experience at Disney and advisory work with startups and scaling companies. Anthony designs human centered systems that drive performance, engagement, and trust. A board member of the World Ethics Organization and a certified Reset It specialist, Anthony blends behavioral science, design thinking, and organizational strategy to operationalize humanity at scale. His thought leadership reframes HR from compliance to experience, building workplaces where people and performance thrive together. Let's welcome Anthony Calleo. Anthony, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to be here. Long-time viewer, first-time guest, so it's great to be here.
Good to have you, Anthony. And I'm very excited for today's topic, and it is a bold message for leaders. You cannot lead others until you've met yourself. Unfiltered, unprogrammed, fully present. Leadership starts where conditioning ends. Anthony, I am very excited to learn more about today's topic. Could you tell me more about the research and data in the field?
Yeah, for sure. And so for that opening statement, what the data tells us is that 70 to 80% of executives report imposter syndrome, right? Which gets talked about a lot in literature. I find often in group settings or even individual settings, it's not always a topic that someone wants to talk about, but that's a pretty high number. And then we know that 60 to 67% of workers hide parts of who they are when they're actually at work, right? So there are parts of who they are that they're not comfortable with sharing at work. And as we said with executives reporting, that's actually higher in the C-suite. So that 60 to 70% is more in the 70, 80% range when we're talking in the C-suite. And in general, 75% of people report hiding aspects of themselves, right? So that for me, that really comes down to while most leaders are publicly carrying a title, privately, they're carrying a lot of question marks.
Interesting. And I actually wanted to learn more about this topic of awareness of themselves, where conditioning ends. I was digging into the research as well, and this comes from Tasha Urich from the Harvard Business Review, and she discovered that 95% of people believe they're self-aware, but only 10 to 15% actually are. Anthony, I want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and that's a great, that's a great segue in what I love to talk about. And so, let me just back up a little bit and say that, current research suggests that we have about 6,200 unique thoughts a day. It used to be much higher, but current thinking is around, although it's not, the current consensus is around 6,000 thoughts. A vast majority of those thoughts are thoughts that we repeat over and over again. And some of that's out of necessity, right? How to drive to work, how to maybe operate, your computer, right? Some of those repetitive thoughts are certainly ones that we want to make sure that we're not rediscovering every day. But in that number, only about 10 to 15% are actually new thoughts and ideas. And again, that's on average. So going back to with that, and taking that into context, and your question and the research that you shared, we are made up of the programs and conditions that have been handed down to us. They've been handed down to us by parents, teachers, influencers that we followed, our colleagues. We all take this mashup of the programs and conditions that they've passed along to us, and then we try to somehow mash those up and make those a representation of ourselves, right? And so that is, to me, the very definition of not being present, right? And so being present and being present as a leader, or in fact an individual contributor, really means that you're operating from your own programming, right? So which is absent absent of the programs and conditions that have been handed down to you. And so that is actually at the root of most of what we're talking about here.
Excellent. And Anthony, I was curious to know, with the conditioning and the habits that we built over time, as you said, that mashup, were there benefits when they first appeared in our lives?
I think that there's benefits in the learning, right? There's benefits in learning language, but when it comes to the actual programs and conditions, which is, how you're going to think or react to a particular situation, how you're going to interact with people, most of those aren't particularly helpful, right? Because the older we get, we start losing that childhood curiosity, right, of questioning why, and then we just start executing on the programming. So in an earlier, in more formative stages, we're actually still, sort of like, soft clay, right? And we're questioning why, and we're using inquisitiveness and playfulness. But the older we get, those start to become far less useful for us. And that's where you wind up finding these feelings of imposter syndrome, or not being enough, or not, of not being aligned with yourself. And that misalignment is what leads to all these frictions and issues.
Anthony, that's an excellent perspective. And actually, I wanted to look more into that. And research from Workplace Insight, I've also pulled this. They've discovered that around 88% of everyday actions are carried out automatically, and 65% are triggered by environmental cues rather than deliberate choice. Anthony, I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that exactly speaks to the whole, what I was talking about before, about how we repeat these old ideas and old conditioning, right? And as much as we talk about innovation in the workplace and thinking about doing things differently, usually under the label of efficiency, right, or immediacy, we end up just executing on what we know. And when we do that on an individual level, a majority of, again, the way we're operating for them is not how we would necessarily handle something, but how our programs and conditions have told us to handle something.
Excellent perspective. And Anthony, let's take a deeper dive. I'd like to learn more about your journey and what gave you the inspiration to jump into this field.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think it really came along with this realization that we all have when we're in the employee experience and company culture space is, as great or as wonderful of these initiatives that we can build and co-create with our companies or our clients, it's how they get executed day in and day out comes down to the people, right? And so that's like, how do you show up to work every day? And that's not only leaders, but that's also individual contributors. So if we're all showing up with our different programs and conditions and not coming in as our present self, that just gets this, you create this, you could call it psychological, you could call it, but I actually think you create this energy field of where you're passing programs and conditions off on one another. You're coming in with that mask, right? If you remember the statistics that we started this with, which, a vast majority of people have imposter syndrome, or they feel like they can't quite be themselves. Behind that mask, there's a lot, we end up generating a lot of friction because you're not uncomfortable, and that can lead to things like passive aggressiveness, or that can lead to lack of trust. So really, when we create this mashup of everyone coming in essentially with their baggage, it's very hard to get really good results.
Wow. Anthony, those are excellent points. And as we're taking a deeper dive, tell me more about the importance of leaders really prioritizing this idea and really applying it into the work they do.
Yeah, no, I love it. So it really, again, it comes down to, I always say, I use this example in the cultural work I do, but, it comes down to have to do's and want to do's, right? When you have somebody that says we have to do something, our employees aren't engaged, or we have to do something, sales are not where they need to be, or we have to do something, we're losing a lot of employees. That's generally an act of desperation, and you're going to end up getting the solution in a month to try to fix it. Is when you shift to that want to do, that's the type of leaders and companies that are going to start to march to where they need to be. So once a leader realizes that they have to shed their inherent programs and conditions and start showing up in a place of presence, because that's a much more comfortable place. And by the way, this is all stuff we carry to home too, right? This doesn't just end when you punch out, right? These are things that we end up bringing back to our homes, and it becomes this, like, it becomes this, vicious circle of catering to those programs and conditions. So once we can work on that, and you can work on yourself and how you're showing up in your present self, you're going to find, and I've not only experienced this with my clients, but I've experienced it with myself. When you're showing up in a state of presence, things start happening and working for you. It's, there's, some people call it manifestation. Other people call it an abundant mindset. Other people on the psychological side just call it, your book of beliefs or the negative stories we tell ourselves. Once we shed all those and we're in a state of presence, you watch the magic happen, really. And that actually has a positive effect on the people that we're interacting with.
Anthony, thank you for sharing. There is so much value in understanding this. And as we're taking a deeper dive, I do have a question about the topic of meeting yourself. When you say meet yourself, what does that look like in a practical day-to-day leadership context?
I mean, in a leadership context, what it really requires is what, I would call a reset, right? What you need to do is you need to reset your programs and conditions, shed the things that not only don't serve you, but don't belong to you in the first place, and just operate, whether it's a leadership or a husband or a spouse or a partner, when you could start leading from a place of presence by shedding those programs, conditions. So, what's your everything from on the work side, what's your definition of what a leader should be? Is it your definition, or is it a mashup of those programs and conditions that have been handed to you? And what does it mean to, be a partner or a husband, right? All of these labels that we have for things are useful for conversation, but if we're taking things that don't belong to us, if we're taking the definitions of each of those items at what it means to be those things based on a mashup of other people and not ourselves, that's where the friction happens. And so the methodology really, or the approach, would be to reset that. And there are, different programs and different processes out there to do that. If you can reset that where it's just you and not your programs and conditions, that's the state in which you want to operate from.
Anthony, very interesting. And when we shed those layers, I was curious, from your perspective, have you found it easy for leaders to embrace that idea, or have you found some resistance from your experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's resistance because it's initially unfamiliar and uncomfortable, right? And in fact, what you'll find is even folks, including myself, that practice this reset it, you have these what we call triggering moments every once in a while, right? Now, what'll happen is, what you'll find over time is the things that trigger you, you'll go from, maybe if something triggered you in the past, you'd have a bad day, week, or month. When something triggers you now, you just have a bad moment, right? You realize, okay, I'm being triggered. I'm being pulled into my which is a flag that you're being pulled into your programs and conditions. You end up recognizing that much quicker and moving out of that, and then getting yourself back into a state of presence.
So is it a state of, do you believe it's a state of resilience where leaders are really overcoming these habits and programming, where they're stepping into new?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think you end up being resilient as a result of it, right? But it really becomes rediscovering your true self, right? Rediscovering that rediscovering that person that you are, as opposed to this mashup of a bunch of things that really do not belong to you.
Anthony, excellent insights. And I was curious, how can people tell the difference between their true voice and the programmed voice they've been conditioned to follow?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes back to what I was saying before, is anytime you find yourself getting triggered, right, that's a clue that there's some sort of misalignment, right? You're getting, and getting triggered could, you break out in a sweat, you feel it in the stomach. For me personally, literally, I get a tightness in my shoulders and neck. And that's a clear indication to me that I'm being triggered by something. And what you'll learn over time, or what you can learn over time, with the right support. And again, this is truly learning, right? This is not about helping you do anything. It's teaching you the technique so you can do it yourself, because you are enough, you are capable of doing this. So it's generally when you find yourself getting triggered, that is a clear indication that you're sliding into your programs and conditions. And so what you're doing is you're grasping at solutions that aren't yours, they're somebody else's.
Anthony, that's a great insight. And digging deeper, I was curious, based on the other people that you've worked with, where do you see conditioning show up most often?
I mean, it really does run the gamut. We have, in the Reset It program, I know you mentioned in the beginning, I am a certified Reset It partner. In the Reset It program, we actually will take folks through, we use this analogy of a tree with branches. And let's say you have, imposter syndrome is one of those, right? We'll go through this process of resetting what imposter syndrome means to you, and both in your programs and conditions, and then your state of presence. But more often than not, there are all these little branches, sub branches that come off of that main branch that are additional issues. So it can range from leadership, love, trust, what it means to even be a salesperson, right? More often than not, people aren't aware of this because of all the training and programs and conditions they received. But salespeople can more often than they realize, set out a "don't buy from me" signal, because they're so trapped in their programs and conditions. You're not making that connection with the person on the other phone. You're going through all these programs and conditions that you learn, and you're not being present and listening to that individual. So it can manifest itself in sales, it can manifest itself in leadership, it can manifest itself in love.
Excellent perspectives to consider. And Anthony, you did mention Reset It. Could you tell us more about the general program behind it and your experience with Reset It?
Yeah, no, for sure. So, going back to my response before about what even led me to where I'm at now, was this realization, as I said, that in order for culture to work, in order for employee experience to work, in order for employee engagement to work, it really makes a difference on how leaders show up, and also individual contributors too. They have a responsibility. And so I searched long and hard to find a program, whether it was a coaching program or some sort of program that really spoke to me and was in line with my philosophy. And lo and behold, the Reset It program came along. And as I studied it and went through it myself, and then eventually became a certified partner, I realized that this was the component I was missing. And I will, even go a little bit further, at the risk of being, completely controversial, and saying that I think this is what's missing in a lot of the programs that are out there. I won't say all, but I think a lot. If you look at some of the programs, they're just these systems passing their programs and conditions on to you. So they're not really getting at the root cause of it. So I found this Reset It program. The founder of Reset It, Mark, him and I were actually fortunately friends before I actually got involved in learning more about his program. So I know where his heart is at. I know where his head's at. And as I used it to work on myself, I realized that this was the missing component.
On that note, Anthony, what were some of the benefits and outcomes that you had experienced from going through the program?
Well, first of all, you're just happier, right? You're not getting triggered constantly, or however often you get triggered, right? And when you do, you're coming back from you're getting back from that state pretty quickly. But more importantly for me, and this has always been important to me, is it helps me show up the way I need to show up for my clients, for my colleagues, for a conversation like this, for my family. It allows me to show up in a state of presence, right? So I'm there for them. And whether it's a piece of advice or just listening, I'm doing it from a state of presence.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing your journey. And speaking of showing up, what are questions that leaders should ask themselves to stay connected to their unprogrammed self, their present self?
I think that, if you're doing this, first of all, from a state of presence, I think two, major leadership components is one is clarity, right? And, so am I being clear on what I expect of my team? What the company expects of me and expects of my team? Is there clarity there? And then, am so it and are my folks clear about what I'm telling them, right? So it's a two-way street, right? If you walk away, the difference between a monologue and a dialogue is I just tell you to go do something and hope that you understood me and that you go off and you do it, right? As opposed to making sure that when you have a conversation with somebody, you first of all, the psychological safety is there, that they can even ask questions and that they can get to a state of clarity, right? So clarity is extremely important. So you want to be clear from a state of presence. And I think empathy is also a really important leadership skill. Being empathetic, and really genuinely putting yourself in the shoes of the person that or that you're trying to communicate with. And you might not necessarily agree with it, but you don't necessarily judge it, right? You don't necessarily automatically assume that because it's not your position, it's wrong. So I think empathy and clarity are really questions that they have to be asking themselves. Am I being clear? Do my people really understand? Do my teams really understand what's expected of them? And there are telltale signs of that not happening. Maybe deadlines are being missed, or things are being delivered not exactly the way you had hoped, right? These are all telltale signs that there's just not enough clarity inside your organization, and it's not part of your leadership program, your leadership efforts, right? And it's more just part of your programming.
Very valuable insights. And speaking of working with others, how can leaders encourage their teams to also lead from their unprogrammed and unfiltered selves and not conditioning?
I mean, ideally, what you want is a team that has, reset it and that's learned the reset it process, right? So if you can have leaders and individual contributors showing up to work environment without their programs and conditions and just the present selves, you're going to see some beautiful things happening. And, we haven't really touched upon it. There is quantum physics science behind what we're suggesting, and it's all around, the old you get back what you put out, right? So when you're bringing that energy and you're bringing that presence to work and everybody is operating in that state, some really incredible, beautiful things are going to happen.
Actually, I'm very interested. Could you tell us more about the quantum physics behind the concept?
Yeah, I mean, it really, it's, there's there's an increasing, there's current science, and, Mark, the founder, Mark Myers, the founder of Reset It, actually has it really spelled out quite nicely on our website. But it really is about what you put out in the quantum energy field, right? The energy that you put out there. Now, for some folks, for some of the listeners, that might be a bit of a bridge too far. I mean, I would hope it's not, but if you don't subscribe to that, just know that there's a lot of psychology behind it, right? Because what'll happen is you start putting up these impossibility walls. Your people on your team and yourself start getting this negative talk and this imposter syndrome. It really begins to seep in. So there's plenty of psychology behind it, but in the Reset It program, we'll argue that there's actually quantum physics, which is literally the energy and the vibration that I'm putting out, right, is what I'm going to receive, right? So if I have a scarcity mindset, I'm going to receive scarcity. If I have an abundant mindset, or if I have a caring, open mindset, I have a clarity mindset, I'm going to receive clarity.
Oh, very valuable perspective. And speaking of which, the energy that we put out as leaders, what happens for the company culture when the leader finally meets their unprogrammed and filtered self?
I mean, really, I don't use this lightly. Magical stuff starts happening, right? You end up, you end up receiving what you need to receive, right? Because you're operating from a state of presence, and you're putting out that positive energy. Again, if that's a bridge too far for anybody, then just know on the psychology, it's grounded. It's also grounded in psychology as well too. That when you're putting that out, you're going to end up being the ultimate emotional intelligent leader. You're going to wind up being a leader who's clear, and you're going to wind up being a leader who's empathetic. And your people are going to begin to see these things, and they're going to, more importantly, begin to feel them, right? And on a conscious and subconscious level. So it has this positive ripple effect throughout the organization, as opposed to think the opposite, right? I'm showing up to work every day. I'm not comfortable with who I am, or I'm afraid to show to my team my authentic self. So I end up wearing this mask. That is emotionally draining, first of all. It ends up leading to a lot of passive aggressiveness. It ends up, what I would argue, sending the wrong energy out into the field, and you wind up receiving that back from your team. And so whether it's subconscious or consciously, people are picking up these cues. And I would argue that this is far and away a lot of the friction that we see inside organizations.
When leaders lead from that presence, those are excellent outcomes. And Anthony, when we look at leadership as a whole, are there any beliefs about leadership you wish people would unlearn?
I mean, yeah, I think there's a lot. Now, some of those are individual, based on the character of, or based on the programs and conditions that you receive. So for me personally, fortunately, unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, I had a lot of not great, I will call them managers. I don't want to give them the label of leaders, very early on in my career. And so they were definitely not folks that I can go to for mentorship. If I had an issue or a challenge with somebody on my team, if I went to them to get their advice, it was often seen as a weakness on my part because I couldn't handle it, right? So these are all characters that if I wanted to, or if I allowed myself to, rather, I could take that and use that as my coaching and training and mentorship reality of not creating those environments for my employees. Now, way before Reset It, I had made the decision that if I'm ever in a position of leadership, right, I'm going to make darn certain I don't make my people feel the way those individuals made me feel throughout my career, right? And to be sure, I had some incredible leaders as well too. And I will credit those managers that I mentioned as informing me of what really not good leadership looks like, right? And so rather than me throwing out, and I share that personal story only because if I threw out a bunch of what I think a good leader is, I'm passing my programs and conditions on to anyone that's listening to this, right? If you're operating from a state of presence, you're going to know what type of leader you need to be because you're going to receive what you need to receive. So rather than me passing on my programming, which is a really important aspect of what we practice and Reset It, quite frankly, because if I'm working with a client or I'm in this conversation and I'm passing my programs and conditions onto whoever's listening right now or my clients, I'm not serving them well. So I need to be in a state of presence. I mean, there are certainly, I would say empathy and clarity are good values to have, but how you interpret those, trust is obviously another big one, but how you interpret those and how you execute on those and how you transmit those are really up to you as an individual doing it from your state of presence.
Anthony, that's a very powerful perspective, and thank you for sharing your journey. And speaking of your journey, I was curious, could you tell us more about your experiences with Disney?
Oh yeah, no, happy. I mean, a lot of what I've learned at Disney has informed what I do now, which is this idea of exceptional employee experience leads to exceptional client or customer experience. Now that's certainly not exclusive, arguably a Disney concept, but Disney, particularly back in the day, really honed the science and the art of what that looks like. So I marinated in that environment. And that really helped inform a lot of the work that I do now on the cultural side. So Disney was, certainly a wonderful experience. Still has all its challenges and opportunities that come with working for a large organization, quite frankly. But definitely the whole notion of the employee experience, customer experience link, well, that is not arguably exclusively Disney. Some of the ways that they did that and some of the secret sauce that they did internally, being exposed to that was super helpful.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing. And speaking of culture, I know you do a lot of work in that field. Tell me more about why culture is valuable to consider as a business strategy.
It goes back to what I said before is, if you look at just about any kind of friction an organization's having, you could trace it back to culture, right? It's just not a happy culture. And I don't think you'll never talk to a single leader that says, I want to have a bad culture, right? But it's like, how much time and attention and intentionality are you putting towards your culture? Because the fact of the matter is, you don't just install your culture and walk away, right? You've got to work it every day. I love the analogy of the constant gardener, right? Once you have that garden built, you got to constantly take care of the soil, and you've got to water, and you've got to weed, right? And you've got to do all those things to constantly make sure that garden flourishes. And culture is the same exact way. And by creating a really good culture, you're creating environments where people want to show up to work every day, their authentic selves, right? Ideally absent of their programs and conditions. And when you have somebody who's showing up and wants to be there most of the time, let's be realistic. It might not be all the time, but like really most of the time, if they're not happy being there, that's going to show up in how they treat internal and external clients. And it's going to have over the long haul, it's going to have a detrimental effect on your organization. It's going to lead to things like burnout. And, I think that, the way I personally look at culture is two ways. One, if you have employees, I think you have a moral obligation to treat them well, right? But beyond that, you have a financial obligation too, because if you take care of your employees, they'll take care of your company. And that's been shown time and time again. And so if you show me a company who's maybe doing exceptionally well, but that's sort of plateaued, or maybe that's not doing particularly great, and you pick any area, it goes down to employee experience and company culture 99.9% of the time.
Anthony, very valuable insights. And as we wrap up, Anthony, what is the best way for people to reach you should they want to learn more about you and the work you do?
I provide a lot of thought leadership on LinkedIn, so I'm more than happy to connect with people. They can either follow my content or reach out, and we could have a deeper conversation about company culture, or I could give them more details on the Reset It program and how to get involved in that. But I would say that certainly CaleoEX.com is another way, but I am super active on LinkedIn. I love interacting with my posts and people. So that's a great place to start.
Excellent. And Anthony, before we go, what is your final piece of wisdom for our audience?
My final piece of wisdom for the audience is, when leaders clear the noise of the old programming and come back to presence, decision-making gets lighter, relationships get more honest, and culture stops being just words on a poster, right? Or on your website, right? They become these lived experiences.
Anthony, that is an excellent piece of wisdom. And for everyone out there, if you know any leaders who would benefit from this conversation, please feel free to share this with them. Anthony, thank you again for today's conversation. Very powerful topic. Really enjoyed learning more about it. It was incredible just getting the insights and perspectives from you. And to everyone out there, thank you again for tuning in. I'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you.